Hey everybody, it's Angel from Halo Inspirations. We give you inspirations to help you spread beauty and joy through your quilting journey. And today's video is just a simple video on a few of my favorite notions that I feel like I just can't live without. Now, we talk a lot about if you're struggling with that, getting the right size block unfinished for you to put in your quilt, like you're not getting that right size. It's usually one of three things: your cutting method, your 1/4 inch seam or your sewing method, and it could be your pressing method. Okay, well, today's video I'm going to talk about 3 notions that I simply cannot live without. Been using a couple of them for years. I found a new one, so that's where this video is coming in. But they help deliver that 1/4 inch seam. And if you're interested, I do have an entire video on a 1/4 inch seam and different methods you could use to get that 1/4 inch seam, and I'll put a link up here, whatever corner it might be. You'll see a little eye. You can click on that and feel free to watch it at your leisure. So what am I talking about today? Well, the first thing that helps me with my 1/4 inch seam is a seam gauge. Now, I'm kind of picky. I have tried a lot of different seam gauges, and either I didn't understand how to use them, or they just didn't deliver the right seam that they said that it would measure to. So this absolutely is my favorite. It is the ideal seam gauge, and you can do seams from 1/8 of an inch all the way up to 1.5 inches, okay? And you wonder, why would I use 1/8 of an inch? If you're doing a stay stitch, that might be a really good, useful gauge to line up for your 1/8 of an inch. And then all the way up to your larger seams that you might use inside of your backing, because you need a larger seam on when you piece your backing together. This delivers all the different sizes, and it does have a 1/4 and a scant 1/4. Most of the time I use a scant, but sometimes I do use a 1/4, a regular 1/4 inch seam. And it offers all of that in one tool. So I'm going to show you how to use this. In the past, and still today, I'm going to show you with it. It's the Ideal Seam Guide. Now, I will tell you, they're both made from the same company. They're made from So Very Smooth. I'm carrying both of these items in my shop currently. So I'll show the link below here, but I'll also put a link in the description so you can click on that and head on over and take a peek. I will tell you that any of the prices listed already include sales tax, and they already include shipping. So the price that you see is the price that it is. So when you hit checkout, there's no additional charges that you'll see down the line. So the Ideal Seam Guide, it is a guide that goes with the gauge. And what I've used this for years. And what I really liked about it is it has a little lip. And I'm going to bring you in closer so you can see this. And I'm going to throw up some pictures. But it has a little hole in here, and that's to allow for your foot, so that if you need to get closer, that it has that room for you. If you are doing something really far out, you have a straight edge on the other side. I don't use this tool to its full advantage because it actually has a rounded side to it, and it helps with curves. I've never used it for that. Like I said, I'm not using it to its full potential, but they have a video out there that explains exactly how to use this in all the different ways, and it's so cool. There's so many things, but it's really thick. So for years and years and years, it didn't matter if I was doing binding or just regular piecing. That lip was big enough that my fabric didn't fold over and I didn't struggle with it. Okay, so I use this for years and years and years. What I find is that you got to pin backwards because the pins won't go over it. It's too thick, so you have to pin the opposite direction. I've taught myself to do it. It's a habit, and now that I have a new seam guide, I'm still finding myself pinning backwards. But this, I still use this for binding. Even though I have a new notion for regular piecing, I'm still using this for binding because it's thick. and I can line that binding up, and I'm not worried about it going over the seam guide, and it's perfect. And it's 10 inches long, and it just delivers a nice straight line for you so that you can get a straight edge once it reaches your needle, because that's part of sewing. You want to sew straight. This helps you deliver that. So I'm going to bring you in closer and I'll show you how to use these, but I'm just giving you a heads up. The new one that I found is called, it's made by Guidelines for Quilting, and it's called the Seam Guides. They're only 1 32 inch thick, okay? So they're very thin. So for my piecing now, I'm using these really tiny seam guides. And if you want a longer straight line, you can just line them up. And I'll show you again when we're closer. But these are amazing. Now with both this Ideal Seam Guide and the Guidelines for Quilting seam guides, they are reusable. So they have a sticky material on the back side of them. You lay it down, it sticks down there, but neither one of these leave any residue. None at all. Amazing, okay? We all don't like residue. And you can reuse them, okay? This one you can't use as many times as this, but you can reuse them. And you just need to be careful with them. But once you pull them up, if you wanted to do some kind of other stitching where you didn't need a guide, you can put them somewhere and reuse these in the future for a period of time. Eventually they go bad, but the stickies don't stick as well. So I'm going to bring you in closer to my sewing machine. I'm first going to show you how to use a gauge, the Ideal Seam Gauge, okay? And I'm going to do it first with the seam guide, and then I'm going to turn around and show you with the Guidelines for Quilting seam guide. So we're going to get started. And I want to remind you, if you like this video, please subscribe and share so somebody else who might need a little guide to get them on the right track for the 1/4 inch seam, they just might want to see this. So at any rate, I'll see you all in a second. We're going to get started. I'm going to pull you in close and show you how to use these tools. I might pull you in closer here in a minute, but I want to show you how to read the seam gauge. Okay, so if you'll notice, and I'll throw a picture up just in case, but it has everywhere from 1/8 inch all the way down here to 1.5 inches marked up here, okay? And I'm going to move my fingers away and you'll see the light go through because there are holes. So I'm going to grab Jack. He's going to be my friend right now. So right here, this hole is 1/8 inch. This hole is a scant 1/4. This is a 1/4. All the way across, you have all these holes where your needle goes. What's really important is that you notice that there are arrows. So you can see them down here. There are arrows pointing. So you have a 1/4 inch and the arrow goes down. What you want to do, that arrow is going to face your fabric. Okay, you're going to point that arrow towards your fabric. So let's pretend that we want a scant 1/4 inch. Okay, so we're going to work with this one right here. All right. Now I have my machine turned off right now. I've got my thread right here, okay? I'm going to slide this underneath to a scant 1/4 inch, and the hole I'm going to be looking for. So I'm going to try and line up my needle to fall down inside of that hole. Okay? And I'm simply going to, at this point, I'm going to turn my machine on. Yep, it's a little bright. And then I'm going to lower my needle down into that hole. Okay? And if you look, it's really tight. Okay? Now I'm going to move the camera. Give me just a half a second. There we go. So I've lowered that needle down into that hole. You can see that. It's lowered right down into that needle. Okay. So that's supposed to give me a scant 1/4 inch. The arrows are facing towards the machine, which also means facing towards the guide. So I'm going to work with with the ideal seam guide. So it's pointing inside the machine, okay? I haven't stuck that down yet. I just want to show you, you lower that needle down into the hole of the desired seam that you want, okay? I actually, when I get it, what I think is straight, I lower my foot for now. That way I know it's not going to move, okay? Then we're going to work with this ideal seam guide, and I'm going to place it next to it. Now, you got to remember, you don't want this part to fall onto the seam guide. So I keep a distance. But if you notice, this whole area, this whole chunked out area is to allow for that foot to sit in there, because the foot is going to come inside this natural line, okay? And then I simply press it down. Now I'm going to pull you out just a second. Look at there. So that's what we're looking at, okay? So now my seam guide's lined up. So I'm going to lift my presser foot. I'm going to lift my needle out of the hole and slide it away. Give it a little press again because there's sticky stuff underneath here. Now, if I wanted to sew 2.5 inch squares together, I'm going to use this seam guide, lower my foot, and I'm able to drop my needle, and I'm going to do this. You're going to see the same pieces, but this is my test. So each of these are 2.5 inch squares. So I would be testing to see 2.5 plus 2.5 inch squares should deliver a 4.5 by 2.5 rectangle. So I would do this to test my seam, okay? Because every fabric is different. So I'd lower my needle, whoop, there we go. And then I'd simply sew, and look, you can see that it just guides along, okay? Now you're gonna see me use that same swatch, and you wouldn't do it that way, because at this point you'd cut your threads and then you'd measure it against your ruler. But I want to show you, in this situation, I'm going to cut threads for a second. In this situation, if I were to put a needle in here, the needle would have to be along here, but it can't hit this lip because this is really, really thick. So what's going to happen, I'm getting my needle ready here. If I wanted to pin this, I'd have to pin, now I wouldn't pin it here, I'm just showing for demonstration. I'd have to pin it on the inside so that when I lined it up, my needle wouldn't hit my seam guide, okay? However, if you were doing binding that's really thick, yeah, if you're going to pin your binding, you'd have to pin this weird direction, but it's so thick that it'll just line up right next to it. Now, I use this method for years and years and years, guys, and you just simply, when you want to pull it up, you just simply undo it, and look, there's no residue. Absolutely no residue. This is an amazing, amazing tool, okay? And I have used it for years, but you do have to pin backwards because the pins, Here, I'll show you. I'm going to put it, I'm not even going to line it up right now. I'm just going to set it down. If I were to put that pin where it stuck out, I couldn't line it up because it's too thick, okay? But I still use this guide for binding, and I use this guide for years, since I was a beginner, and I just got addicted to it, and I love it because it helps with the seam guide, or the seam gauge. It helps deliver that 1/4 inch seam. So I just have simply learned to pin my fabric backwards, and it doesn't hit the seam guide, okay? But now with the guidelines seam guide, oh, I think this one's an older one. Okay, we're gonna line up again a scant 1/4 inch. Remember, the arrow's gotta face towards the machine, okay? I'm gonna pull my thread out. I'm gonna line this up underneath. I'm gonna try to get that needle right in that hole. There we go. If you can see, let me pull you in closer. You can see that it's right in that hole, so I can't move it. But I need to make sure that this seam gauge is straight, because I'm going to take my guideline. So first I'm going to lower my presser foot. Let me make sure this is straight. Okay. I still don't want it to be underneath the presser foot, so I'm going to do it just a little bit outside. I'm going to simply stick it down. I'm going to pull my needle up. I'm going to pull you out here so you can see. There you go. That's all there is. Now, if in fact you wanted to make a longer line, because this is pretty short, right? See if I can pull you out further. Yep, I sure can. Okay. So if I wanted to if I wanted a longer line, I would just simply line these up, one right after the other, and it gives me a longer line. But these are super thin. So watch what happens when I pin the correct direction. Now remember, this is not normally how we pin. Normally we pin this direction, right? It is small enough that it just slides right with it. Okay, there we go. Begin to sew right along, and I don't even have to hold that. I'm just sewing right along it. I should have taken the needle out. I'm sorry, I totally forgot. But I was just trying to show you that that needle, you could stop the machine right before that needle hits, before that pin hits the needle, and you can continue sewing after that. Here, I'll do it again. So we're going to line it up underneath. The needle is sitting beautiful. It allows it to guide itself. I'm going to drop the needle. I'm going to sew along, and right before that needle hits, I'm going to pull that needle out and just continue to sew. And I'm going to show you. I'm done with this. Look, no residue. Absolutely zero residue. So this is my new favorite, this Guidelines for Quilting seam guide. They're on back order right now, but when they come in, I'll be putting them on the shop, in the shop also, so you can purchase them. I'm telling you, between the seam gauge, okay, the seam guide by So Very Smooth, which has the really thick line, still left no residue, and then the guidelines for quilting seam guide, okay? Those help me tremendously to get that 1/4 inch seam. So I hope this was helpful. Let me know if there's any questions you may have or something you'd rather see, and I'll do it for you. Okay, so there you have my favorite notions to get that 1/4 inch seam in the right place to get my test blocks at a 4.5 by 2.5, because remember I take two 2.5 inch blocks together, squares together, and that gives me a 4.5 by 2.5. The ideal seam gauge, the ideal seam guide, and the guidelines for quilting, seam guides. All of these items together help me deliver that correct 1/4 inch seam. If you're a beginner, I would highly suggest the thicker one, the Ideal Seam Guide by Sew Very Simply. It'll give you everything that you need, and it helps you to sew a straight line, and it's really thick so your fabric doesn't go wonky on you. This is the tool for a beginner, I promise you. And like I said, I still use it for my binding. The Ideal Seam Guide by Sew Very Simply and the Seam Gauge are both in my shop right now. You can purchase those today. The guidelines for quilting seam guides, these little tiny 1/32 of a thick guide, they're on back order, but as soon as they get shipped to me, they'll be in my store ready for you to purchase. But yes, if you're struggling with getting that right size test block or those right size blocks, you might want to look into getting them a seam guide and a seam gauge to help deliver that. And I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop them in the comment below. Or I will be today on Facebook Live on our business page. Link is also down below. I'd love to see you there. But until next time, may y'all continue to be inspired, productive, and joyful, and never stop making those dreams in quilting come true. I love y'all. I'll see y'all soon.